This is Walter Bosley, and I'm going to read a selection from Blacklisted by History, The Untold Story of Senator Joe McCarthy, by M. Stanton Evans. Samson in the Heathen Temple. So finally they got him. How they did it is fairly plain and instructive when the methods are considered. Why they did it is less apparent, as there were many theys involved, and a melange of motives converging at the point of censure. Least clear of all is what the whole thing meant when it was over. To all appearances then and later, a crushing defeat was inflicted on McCarthy when his colleagues voted to condemn him. The defeat wasn't merely the 3-1 division in favor of the formal verdict, but the informal penalties that followed. For many in the political world and press corps, he became a non-person to be ignored and shunned, a ghost figure with no relation to the serious business of the Senate. Reporters who once hung on his every word now observed a tacit compact to treat him as if he were no longer there, which perhaps, in other than a purely physical sense, he wasn't. Even worse for McCarthy was what happened to his name, record, and reputation in the ensuing decades. He died on May 2, 1957, just 30 months after the censure vote, and was taken back home to Appleton to be buried on a quiet hillside by the Fox River. He was only 48 when he died, an incredibly young age even then for one once physically so strong, albeit with his share of ailments. Many observers thought he drank himself to death. Others theorized foul play. Still others that the censure and the ostracism had robbed him of the will to live. Whatever the specific medical causes, it seems likely the terrific bouts of unremitting struggle and incessant pressure had taken their toll for some time before this. For most of the 5 years that his doings transfixed the nation, McCarthy was locked in mortal combat with the most powerful forces in the land, including 2 presidents of the United States, vast bureaucratic empires, formidable adversaries in Congress, relentless leftward lobby groups, and a horde of press, TV, and radio critics who made him their daily target. Even more to the point, he had been put through the ringer of endless, back-to-back investigations and repetitive charges that drained time and energy, sapped his strength, and blocked him from pursuing the mission to which he was devoted. The psychological stress resulting from it all, while he was being portrayed to the American people as a monster, is hard to imagine. That it led him to drink, as many anecdotes allege, seems plausible indeed. So does the notion that the combined unbearable burden finally broke his health and killed him. However that may be, his early death and the scattering of his staffers and records put an end to whatever nucleus there was of a pro-McCarthy information or expertise remaining after the censure was voted. Some, such as J.B. Matthews, still kept their files on cases. Some, like journalist Ralph de Toledano and committee staffer Jim Juliana, squirreled away remnants of McCarthy's papers. Some carried on the struggle in other venues. But there was no successor or political keeper of the flame, nobody in particular beyond his widow who would try to salvage his name or some kind of honorable place in history for him. Indeed, as time went on, the trend was all the other way around. McCarthy was dead and gone, his reputation in ruins after the Army hearings and the censure. Why bother trying to defend the indefensible? There were other things to do, other battles to be fought. No point in wasting time and resources on a cause so totally lost as that. And, perhaps more compelling, no desire to link other causes to the name of one thus reviled and battered, and now in death past caring. For these reasons and some others, the field of McCarthy studies and related Cold War history was left mostly to his political foes, dominant in intellectual circles when he lived, and virtually unchallenged in academic and media precincts since. With a handful of exceptions, what purport to be histories of the era or biographies of McCarthy have been written by his severest critics. The views of his opponents are thus presented as the so-called facts, while significant data to the contrary have been denied, distorted, and in many cases suppressed entirely. It was precisely here, of course, that the total and eternal destruction of McCarthy, or what appears to be such, was accomplished. 5 decades of vilification, each new version heaped on and compounding those that went before it, scores of books and essays, countless media recaps driving home the message, spreading the villainous image to the widest possible public. And over this same span of 50 years, little or nothing of countervailing import. As suggested in preceding pages, the cost of all this in terms of empirical truth and historical understanding have been great. We need only note that standard treatments of McCarthy and histories of the age that delve into these matters repeat in pertinent detail the spurious version of McCarthy's early cases, invented by Tidings and his State Department allies. The Wheeling 205, the ersatz radio affidavits, the innocuous Lee list, the 4 committees, all recycled in pat formulations with no hint as to the bogus nature of these factoids. As has been shown, this Tidings version of the matter is false in virtually every aspect, and where not conclusively so is sharply contrary to the available record. Its falsehood is the more egregious considering the deceptions used in putting it together, the backstage collusion with the State Department, vanishing documents and transcripts, the recording Tidings professed to have, but did not. Given all of which, we may well ask, why has the Tidings version been accepted, embellished, and purveyed to readers as a factual treatment of McCarthy's early cases? Similar questions might be raised about other chapters in the story. Naming the names, the Gillette Committee's concealments and evasions, the multi-layered cover-ups of Amerasia and felonious clearing of John Service, the Annie Lee Moss charade, and so on in grim procession. One has to search long and hard in conventional histories to find discussions of these matters that make the essential facts of record clear to the average reader. That McCarthy made his share of errors, some contributing to his downfall, is true enough. A number of such have been noted in these pages. Errors of detail in the presentation of his cases. The Marshall speech, a huge error of judgment, and to some degree as well of fact. The unprovable espionage charge against Owen Lattimore. The emotional blow-up with Zwicker. The use of harsh invective against various foes, though no harsher than the invective used against him. And errors, too, of omission. Failure to tell the Senate he was mining data from the Lee list. Not reining in Roy Cohn when he was badgering the Army about Shine. These and other McCarthy miscues were important, not only because they were wrong or maladroit per se, but because in the usual case they gave hostages to his opponents, who repeatedly used them to deflect attention from questions of lax security and loyalty risks on federal payrolls, and make McCarthy himself the issue. He thus strengthened the hands of powerful foes who had more than enough political media muscle to begin with. It would be possible simply by stringing such episodes together to build an indictment of McCarthy, which, of course, the usual histories do. However, these treatments invariably tilt the verdict by omitting or glossing over the cases in which he was proved right, such as Amerasia, the IPR, the debacle of State Department security practice, a long list of suspects from Gustavo Duran to Aaron Coleman, and countless others. A true balance sheet would have to include all this and a good deal more of similar nature to be even remotely accurate in its conclusions. And of course, the ledger can't be confined just to McCarthy, as if he were the only player in the drama. His record needs to be set over against that of his opponents, from Tidings and the State Department to Joe Welch and Stevens Adams. On that kind of balance sheet, it's plain that McCarthy was far more sinned against than sinning, and that on the central issues he was chiefly right, and his opponents chiefly in error. This was most obviously true in the early going against Tidings and the Gillette Committee, but would remain so in later battles also. Perhaps the easiest way of judging the matter is to note that McCarthy throughout was battling for public disclosure of the relevant data, while the typical stance of his adversaries was to suppress or obscure the facts on whatever pretext. Usually in such confrontations, it isn't difficult to figure out that the people trying to hold back information are the ones who will be embarrassed by it, and thus the people who aren't being truthful. Concealment of data by his foes was so consistent a feature of the McCarthy saga, it's hard to believe the writers who take the part of his opponents can't see it. And of course, it wasn't just concealment. It's impossible to study the gross deceptions of the Tidings report, the bizarre testimony of Tidings about the supposed recording from Wheeling, or the clanking contradictions of Bob Stevens and John Adams about the genesis of their charges against McCarthy, without seeing the pattern of flagrant falsehood. The point is significant in itself, but becomes the more so when we consider the things that were being concealed or palpably misstated. Despite all of which, our histories and biographies across a span of decades have depicted Tidings, Stephen Adams, and all the rest as the good guys, relatively speaking, and McCarthy as the villain. In trying to understand all the slanted history and why it continues, it's well to stress again that more is involved here than the doings of McCarthy. The real issue has always been the larger question of what actually happened to America and the world at the midpoint of the 20th century, what it meant, and who was responsible for it. The point of the standard treatments, as seen, isn't merely that McCarthy was mistaken, but that the perspective he represented itself was evil and needs everywhere to be combated. Nowhere is this more apparent than in discussion of the China hands in the State Department. There have been countless books and essays through the years, not merely justifying but glorifying those such as John Stuart Service, John Carter Vincent, John Peyton Davies, and others at State for their alleged foresight on events in China. It is this view of the China issue and others like it that dictates the author's attitudes on McCarthy. He was wrong because the China hands were right, or so these volumes tell us. From this angle, once more, McCarthy was almost an incidental figure. The motivations to write the history this way would be the same even if Joe McCarthy had not existed. On the other hand, McCarthy in his heyday became a very consequential figure indeed, precisely because he threatened this reading of America's till then feckless Asian policy and those complicit in it. His 1950 charges and the explosion of public protests that followed hit the Atchison State Department, its China hands, and their various outside allies with stunning force, thus upsetting the plans and interests of many influential people. Numerous histories and biographies written in the intervening decades have been attempts to repair this damage, to win on the battlefield of history the war for public opinion that was lost so badly in the early 1950s. And that, of course, is the other side of the story in deciding whether McCarthy was defeated or was, in some sense, the victor. It's true that ultimately they got him, but it's equally true that before this happened, he got them, or at least a sizable number of them. In case after significant case, Service, Vincent, Lattimore, Jessup, Brunauer, O. Edmund Clubb, and scores of others, McCarthy's targets were driven from the field, and with them, the Amerasia IPR agenda for more Far East capitulations. It's doubtful that any other American figure outside the confines of the White House had more impact on the course of Cold War history. Whether that impact was for good or ill, of course, depends on one's perspective. There were some other consequences also, and what might be viewed as collateral McCarthy damage. The communist agent, Mary Jean Keeney, would finally lose her job at the United Nations, while the Soviet henchman Saul Adler decided in May 1950, at the fever pitch of the McCarthy furor, that the time had come to quit the Treasury and leave the country. Lachlan Curry, though no longer holding a federal job, had been hanging around since 1945. He, too, departed in 1950. Perhaps it was mere coincidence that these two Soviet agents decided to skip precisely at this juncture. And perhaps it wasn't. Still, other direct and indirect examples of McCarthy's impact might be cited, most notably the firming up of security measures by the Truman administration in late 1951, switching from the unworkable so-called reasonable grounds criterion to reasonable doubt, as recommended by Hiram Bingham, providing some realistic prospect of ousting egregious risks who lingered on the federal payroll. Such was the trend toward tougher McCarthy-driven security measures that developed in the early 1950s, the so-called Reign of Terror. There are more instances of the McCarthy effect, but a couple relating to the Ike age and McCarthy's tenure as committee chairman are offered here by way of wrap-up. It's a remarkable but generally neglected fact that every major McCarthy investigation in the period of 1953 to 54 resulted in some significant change in governmental practice. The State Department files, the business about Baker West, books in overseas reading centers, the loyalty drill at GPO, the Pentagon security days suggested by Perez and Moss, and so on. In every instance, the officials in charge admitted there had been enormous foul-ups and moved to take corrective action. And there were also, as in the Truman era, some indirect consequences of McCarthy's hearings. As the executive sessions and backup committee records show, McCarthy, beginning in 1953, was on the trail of Robert Oppenheimer, a fact well known to Ike and his lieutenants. There isn't much doubt this helped force the hand of the administration, impelling it to move on Oppenheimer before McCarthy did so. Thus, Oppenheimer, too, could be added to the list of those who were in some fashion alleged victims of McCarthy. As to the why of the fierce opposition to McCarthy and reasons for the censure vote, there were, as noted, different motives that came together to produce that outcome. The situation is clearest with respect to the Senate's liberal Democrats and even with some of their conservative brethren. McCarthy was a thorn in the side of the Democratic Party, as the issues of infiltration and security laxness all had their genesis under Roosevelt and Truman. The clamor McCarthy raised was extremely harmful to their party, which helps explain why, under Truman, every possible measure was taken to thwart McCarthy and obscure the truth about his cases. Less understandable was the commitment of a Republican White House to cooperation in the censure, cooperation decisive to its success. Though there were obvious tensions all along, McCarthy, until late in the day, made it a point to say the problems he was addressing weren't the doing of the Ike administration. This became harder to maintain when it came to open warfare in the Army hearings, but even here, from the J.B. Matthews blow-up forward, the moves that escalated the battle into fratricidal mayhem came more from the administration side than from McCarthy. Add the fact that the Army hearings and the censure battle were disastrous for the Republican Party, heading into a tough election year that cost it control of Congress. Given all those factors, and even discounting for the detestation of McCarthy by many Ike advisors, the White House drive to annihilate him is something of a puzzle. One answer appears to be that the president and some of those around him thought McCarthy was trying to take over the party and planned to challenge Ike himself in the 1956 election. These apprehensions weren't too realistic, and there is no evidence McCarthy seriously had such ambitions. He certainly had made no concrete plans to this effect that anyone was ever aware of. However, the Gallup poll in January of 1954 showed, rather incredibly considering everything that had been said about him for 4 years running, that 50% of the American electorate had a favorable opinion of McCarthy versus only 35% unfavorable. The Army hearings and censure battle would change those numbers in drastic fashion. That McCarthy was a flawed champion of the cause he served is not in doubt, and who among us isn't? It would have been better had he been less impulsive, more nuanced, more subtle in his judgments. On the other hand, somebody more nuanced and refined wouldn't have dreamed of grappling with the forces deployed against him. Those forces were powerful, smart, and tough, and they played for keeps. Taking them on was the task, not for a Supreme Court justice, but for a warrior. McCarthy, to his dying breath, was that. Measured by the total record of his cases and political battles, McCarthy, whatever his faults, was a good man and true, better and truer by far than the tag teams of cover-up artists and backstage plotters who connived unceasingly to destroy him. The truth he served, moreover, was of the greatest import, the exposure of people who meant to do us grievous harm, and of long-standing indifference toward this menace by many at high official levels. In so doing, he summoned the nation to a firm-willed resistance to the communist challenge, both abroad and on the home front. At the peak of his influence, the storm of protest he ignited shook a negligent ruling class to its foundations and scattered a host of furtive agents its lassitude had sheltered. In the end, he perished, politically and otherwise, in the rubble he pulled down around him. Yet, when the final chapter in the conflict with Moscow was written, amid yet another pile of rubble, he was not without his triumph. This is Walter Bosley, and I've just read a selection from Blacklisted by History, The Untold Story of Senator Joe McCarthy by M. Stanton Evans.